Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. On today's episode, we are talking about the book Making Numbers Count: The Art and Science of Communicating Numbers by Chip Heath and Karla Starr. And I am talking with my special guest, Melody Barron. And I'm excited to have you joining with me today. Can you introduce yourself a little bit, Melody, and how you came across this book?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am a second grade teacher turned educational small business owner. Previously, those businesses were primarily focused on tutoring. But this year, after many years in the works, I started a new business focused on supporting families to team up and build their autonomy.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, you also asked me how I came across the book.
Right.
And that is thanks to you. And
I know, I totally led you on that one.
You told me at WDS that you had seen Karla Starr speak and about this book, and then I went and got it because you're always a trusted source. And loved it immediately. I actually, I bought it, but I also listened to the audiobook. It's great. So,
yeah. And seeing Karla Starr speak, she spoke about writing this book, by the way. So the backstory is, I had read this book. I'm like, oh, another book by Chip Heath. I generally like Chip and Dan Heath, their books. I've read a number of them over time. They're interesting. They're actionable. They're generally like what they have to say. And so I was looking back at my notes for this book because I am a nerd and take notes when I read books. And I was like, yeah, Making Numbers Count by Chip Heath. I didn't even have Karla Starr on my little note. And then hearing her speak, she did not have a good time writing this book with Chip Heath. So I'm like, oh, I've learned some of the dirt about the backstory of working with this fella. I don't know Chip or Dan Heath. Dan, though, because of another part of a book that they wrote about, The Power of Moments, which is another book on this podcast. I ended up doing some follow-up with him. They were like, hey, this book is new. We're going to explore this thing. So I'm like, oh, yeah, I'll take part in this little survey thing. So I got a note from Dan Heath at one point, not Chip, who wrote this book. So I'm like, oh, yeah, Dan and I are totally besties. Just kidding. I've never spoken to either of them live in my life. But Karla Starr, who wrote this, actually, we both live in Portland, another part of this backstory, and Karla Starr lives in Portland. I'm like, oh, I want to be her best friend and track her down. I've not done that. I'm not a stalker, but I did subscribe to her newsletter, which is fascinating. She enjoys, so this book is about numbers and using numbers well. And my impression is that she's a researcher. I don't know her entire academic backstory, but she enjoys being really precise about how other people are wrong in their grandiose claims and their blabberfest that they put out there on the internet or make them really popular. So her talk I saw was a takedown of some very popular, apparently internet guru kind of fella that was like, oh, he says this, and in reality, it's not that. This is actually not accurate, not true. So that's what I loved about Karla, iconoclastic, and wrote this book. And Chip Heath apparently was also involved in a way that was hard and challenging for her as a person. But the book was great. And so that's why I recommended it to you after seeing Karla speak. And I'm curious if there are parts of the book that stuck out to you as being super interesting or useful or actionable or just caught your eye as you read along.
I, too, am a nerd. I have tabs all over this thing. I thought it was very useful. Let's see. One of such things. So she talks about our brains being a complex web of associations. So we can access pieces in different ways, and that there's one complex network that is larger and quicker to access than all others, and that's the self. And I immediately, so from teaching, assimilation is always talked about. You want to find the most connection points possible to in someone's brain to bring this new information in and find a way for them to weave it in, and then they'll have a better chance for remembering it. I had not yet heard that, which makes sense though, that the self is this big old blobby, easily accessible.
Yeah.
Hijacky.
How to be relatable is to talk to people in a way that makes sense to them as a human, basically. And you're like, duh. And then on the flip side, you're like, oh, that's actually not as easy as it sounds, I think, in another way. I think that this book goes into that. Cool, we want things to be relatable, and specifically around numbers, because numbers can get not relatable extremely quickly. They talk about how after about 5 of a thing, the brain's just like, it's a lot. I don't even know. Like, there's just a bunch out there. We got 1 to 5 and then a bunch. We're like, who cares after that? The brain just doesn't operate on that scale. And the scale is 5. It's not like a million or it's like 12 even. It's 5.
Yeah, I also was surprised by that number. But I thought she just did such a wonderful job of just like validating everyone's math trauma from school. It's just like, oh, this isn't how we think, and we're not built that way. And I loved that she, to that point, kind of like advocated for people who are in charge of sharing numbers, that like it's really your responsibility to put it in a package that people can understand. And here's this whole book full of ways you can do that.
Yeah.
That, by the way, is for anyone that's considering picking up this book. I love the kind of book that you could just scroll through. There's like these rectangles throughout the book that compare a way that you could say it and then a better way to say it. And dang, they're just so like, it's instantly clear and useful. And you could just scan the whole book like that to kind of pick up.
Oh, yeah. It's like a tool after tool after tool after tool. Like there's so many ways that, and there's so many situations where we actually need to convey numbers or an amount. You know, we need to be like, this is big, but not just like kind of big. This is hugely big, right? And so that's some of what we need to communicate. It's not just a number like this is 700. And you're like, well, I don't even know how many 700 is, like whatever. Or we need to say this is actually of a scale so massive that we need to take action. You know, to be motivated to do things, we actually need to understand the scale of things at times. And so that's what this book is really about. Tools for conveying numbers, but also magnitude in a way that's meaningful and, I mean, basically meaningful, often to get people to take action, because we're like, it's a lot. I don't know, whatever. It's more than 5. Who cares? Which is apparently what we default to all the time.
Yeah, that there was a lot of good stuff in here, right? About like bigism and then like psychological numbing, I think, like is just yeah, kind of had the 1-2 punch of giving you this great kind of like neurological way in which we as humans respond to things, and then okay, so what to do with the fact that when you throw a number like 332 million at people, it's just sounds like a lot, and how do you do better? There was some good stuff in here about that. Something about progress. I know there is one thing that talked about the power of one, like, and putting things more into a progress. I'm trying to think of what the example was, but
like a process, do you mean? Like, or that we don't want, if we just number things, it doesn't always make sense. Like if we're just counting, but like if it's a process that unfolds over time, we attach to it very differently because we see things as changing and evolving, and we grasp changing and evolving differently than we can grasp 1, then 2, then 3, then 17, then 400, along the way.
Yeah. That stuff probably like that's the stuff I feel like I've scratched the surface of in my mind. I want to use, definitely want to remember to come back and use that in the future in my work, because it's just like so instantaneously obvious. There was the thing about Evian bottles, which was kind of mind-boggling. Like, and so the like kind of rough example was buying a bottle of Evian is 3,970 times more expensive than filling the bottle from your faucet in San Francisco, I guess.
And we're like, what does that even mean? 3,000? Like,
yeah, it sounds, it doesn't hit you at all. And then like in the flipped example, she essentially talks about it unfolding over time so that you could refill your bottle once a day for 10 years, 5 months, and 21 days. And before it would cost you $1.35. Like, then it landed.
Oh yeah. She talks as really, I think a lot of the great examples about like sort of shifting the, it's not like the metaphor, but basically shifting the realm the thing is. Because you're like the cost percentage, like we don't get a cost percentage, but time, we're like, oh, I get 10 years of time. Like that's actually a long time. And I think there's another example where they talk about if you like then you put that in human scale, like you add that amount of time. So if you want the cost of an Evian bottle, if instead you started a baby filling that bottle every day, the baby would be in 5th grade by the time you've paid for the bottle, you know, like whatever it is. I don't think a 10-year-old is in 5th grade, whatever, who knows. But like basically we put that scale, we add another scale that we relate from being a baby to a 5th grader is hugely different, you know, or whatever it is. And that's how long it takes us to actually, if we filled that bottle out of our tap, that would have been the same expense, cost dollars and cents as buying a bottle of Evian at the store or whatever. So it's, yeah, there's like layers within layers, but they become much more personal layers. And yeah, she talks a lot about the example of making it personal to people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot of good points trying to get after that, but and like each thing that we talk about reminds me that I think early on in the book, she says something about this because she's kind of cheeky sometimes and talks about like, hey, this numbers book is actually about relationships. You didn't know, but about how much, connection and really talking to people as if they're people and giving them real world examples. It came up in all these different ways. So she ended up giving a number of different kinds of examples, but that intersected back into like, talk to people about their real lives as if they're real people and put them in that context, and you'll have them hooked. And there's all these different ways to do it.
Yeah. And like we are very emotional about ourselves in a way we're not at all emotional about like cold, hard numbers, you know, or whatever it is. So the more, yeah, she talks about like being personal, but being personal that like if you have one example that's a human personal example that's better than 1,000 numbers that don't make sense to anybody. Like a human example is always better. Like a first grader, baby to 5th grade is a better example than whatever 300,000%. You know, and you're like it's not human. It's not on a human scale. She talks about the scale. Like we need a human scale of things because our brain doesn't go that big. But being personal about that scale, like the more personal, the better, almost.
Yeah. And I think there was even this kind of like, because I remembered saying something like, people tend to like be willing to go with you on a little bit of a journey, a little bit of a story. We're so much more built for story. And then they'll also like insert themselves into most any story. So there's something about, like making sure you have a sense of the kind of feeling you want people to feel and then look for stories that elicit that feeling for them. And they'll like connect themselves into that. So
yeah. And I think all of her examples are super well-researched examples. What I know of her as a person is she is the researcher who's not just going to make up some example from outer space, but these are really very well-researched examples. And I could tell that's interesting that you said that, like, you look at the emotional impact you want to have at the end and then sort of find the piece in between that gets the numbers to that emotional impact, because that's a black box for many people. And like, no, the numbers should tell people 1 billion is a lot. And you're like, it's a lot. I don't, like we don't grasp that. But she gives such great examples that make you feel this sense of triumph over numbers being explained well. It's like so triumphant in this book, like through reading these different examples that like, here's a classroom example, or here's a NASA example, or here's a, blah, blah, blah. Like they're from all these different realms. And I think that's interesting that the emotional state is what you want. I'm like, oh, it's not like, you don't come off being like, oh, this is so easy, but you're like, oh, if you do it well, it's so gratifying to do this well.
Yeah. There was so much feeling in this number. There's like, I know that I'll go back to it all the time because and maybe that's something in the brain or just my brain, but it's like I had all these key takeaways and I remembered key concepts from the book, but I still can't, like, that probably still wouldn't help me write it. The examples are really what make the connection to how that really works. Such a good book.
Right. And I think there's like the principles are really simple, right? Like make something abstract concrete. Got it. Okay, no problem. I've heard that before, whatever. But then when you see it in action, like an abstract number to a really concrete example. And she talks about like really pretty simple steps for doing this, right? She's like, just round all the numbers up. Like no one wants a percentage, a decimal, a weird fraction, 12/17. You're like, no one knows. Like round this to something that we can at least get a fragment of our brain around as something we've heard before, right? Being like really concrete, really simple, and using like here's this other funny rule that's about like, round with enthusiasm. Concrete is better. Whole numbers are better. and follow the rules, but defer to experience. Like, and if your audience you're talking to is really aware of a certain example set, great. Use what your audience is aware of. And like we're talking in generalities for like humans being aware of, but if you're talking to, I know you work with parents a lot, and if parents are like pairing socks up, they have this number of like, yeah, I need to pair up socks. Great. We have this idea of pairing things already. So now we can use that as an easy metaphor, an easy way to connect numbers to like, oh, I'm just actually matching things. Got it. Like I'm aware of that. Like these two things fit. And so your audience is super tuned into that versus another audience might be like, I don't, whatever. Like that's not as relevant of an example for some folks.
Yeah, like you're making me think of all those different ways because they were with the assimilation thing and the more places that you can connect. So yeah, if you can get to know your audience well and be thinking in all those different ways, I thought that was. And you're also reminding me that in the defer to expertise, that was like, because I just love, especially a researcher, but any author that will accept when I'm wrong or like accept work. I really like when they go, when you need to be prepared to throw this all out the window if you have experts that can handle, like there was a baseball example and they want it in a percentage. Like,
yeah, they want 3 decimal points. Like you don't give a batting average as just 1 decimal point. No, that's always to the 3rd decimal point, which in other areas, people are like, whoa, like this doesn't matter. But the 3.7 versus 3.75 batting average, crazy different. Like that audience knows that difference and can make that's a thousandth of a whatever point difference is relevant and meaningful and trackable by baseball fans, I would say broadly can track those stats to that level. Committed fans, I don't know if you're a casual fan, maybe not, but it matters and is relevant. And other fields, you're like, yeah, don't tell me how many thousandth of a difference is happening here. It's no relevance to me whatsoever.
Totally. Yeah.
That's a great one. Yeah, because that audience cares and understands.
Probably so much to the point that you would probably lose them by following the original, like 1 and 2. That the baseball fans would be like, I'm sorry, what is 0.7 batting average? Unacceptable. Like,
yeah, that's not that. That doesn't even make sense. Yeah, you would get some flack for that for sure. For sure. I mean, but she also talks along the way about like you're not just trying to convey numbers better, you're giving demonstrations, you're creating models, you're making scale models. Like you're just trying to find different ways to share this information that is relevant and that is meaningful, right? And there's so many ways to be meaningful and relevant with information about numbers and scale of things.
Yeah. I'll just say yeah again. I think the multiple yeahs there is that I'm literally looking down at the book right now, and I just I'm so impressed by books that also do a good job of both things, like give you some really clear small number of things to refer back to and to use as tools, and then it's just full of all these useful examples that are meaningful in different ways. And that to me comes back to the like that I think about this a lot. I often say that language, we made it up. It's like my short history in language. We made it up.
Oh, that's great. Good. Good. I'm in on that. I believe it. Yes.
Yeah. It's easy to forget, and there's something about being an educator and kind of being. I always call that kind of like being behind the scenes or behind the curtain, and then you go, oh wait, yeah, that's right. We're just like back here deciding like what's important and what we learned, and somebody was back here deciding what words meant. But like at the end of the day, language is a tool, and so if you're using words or numbers or ideas to kind of like about you, like to put yourself forward as oh, I know things and these are special, but the other person doesn't take anything away from it, then what are you doing? You're not for communicating. So I think that it's so important that when you remember that, like you can made up words, like it's all about your audience and finding a way to connect. And I guess this also, I know you will feel the same way. I guess this podcast is in a similar vein. Like there's so much amazing research being done these days. But there is much less, I think even in the book, she uses like the term like bridging that gap. And I'm just all about anybody that recognizes that why let all this really important work go to waste? Take the time to find the ways to bridge the gap. So
yeah, when you're making those models or maps or comparisons or analogies, we're building more connections, right? And when we try to just let things be a number, like the number will stand for itself, it doesn't. And if it does, it's boring and no one cares unless you have context around that. And I think this book is really about building that context for that understanding by bridging those gaps to different areas of like making it personal for sure is one of those, but also making, like, she picks examples from so many different aspects of the world and life. And, here's a healthcare example, and here's a blah, blah, blah example, and here's a school example. They're just such a wide variety of examples, but they're all really, obviously there's a theme about the numbers, and this book is actually tiny. It's a really short book. But it doesn't feel dense. It doesn't feel like, oh, they had to write extra fine print. It's a very, I don't even know if it's 100 pages. It's a short little book in the physical copy that I got from the library. And there's a lot of pictures and charts and diagrams and these side boxes and little different pieces of it. But it's so every page is useful. I don't feel like there's any fluff in this book, but really because it's about building those connections. Like, here's whatever, 1,000, not 1,000, obviously. Here's 15 ways to build these connections in your brain between humans and numbers and how to convey that. And now I'm just going to fire them off one after another so that they get in your, you get the examples, they get in your head more easily. But that's still building such a variety. There's a huge variety of ways to convey this information.
Absolutely. Which is just I think that gets overlooked these days. There's it's easier than ever to write a book and publish a book. And, there's lots of people out there in the space compiling information and sharing it. But to me, it's a much rarer book that, kind of walks its talk, so to speak. And to me, this book is full of that. It does really nice jobs of building upon itself. There's plenty of storytelling, even kind of outside of the examples. And there's that whole chapter I'm remembering on, was it Florence Nightingale?
Yes, so great. Why Florence Nightingale was so cool. Because she was good at conveying numbers. That's it. That's her actual contribution to the world. Because people are like, oh, soldiers are dying in Crimea, whatever. That's a bummer. And she's like, look, these people are statistically dying at a crazy high rate. We can fix it. Look, we fixed it over here. She brought sanitation to hospitals, essentially, was her other contribution. But she got that to happen by getting resources committed to that because she could convey how many more people were dying there versus at home. And she had this example of, imagine this drill field with 100 people in it. Now imagine 85 of them are dead because they didn't have clean water or bandages. Okay, cool. There's 15 people in this field over here. You see that? That's how many lives we could be saving. Whatever it was. He was super crystal clear in a way that people were like, oh my God, we're letting people die everywhere. And she's like, yeah, fund better hospitals, fund sanitation essentially in hospitals.
And I think there was an example as well, speaking to that, make the person think it's about them or in the consequences of it. And so I think she even took it outside of the battlefield at one point and was talking about these numbers are equivalent to taking this many people just down the street and shooting them
yeah.
And so it created this really much more direct, we would never find this acceptable outside of the battlefield. Why are we accepting these numbers within it?
Right. Yeah. And so basically Florence Nightingale's gift was being a really good communicator. She was a scientist. She could see what was going on. She understood what was happening, but she could communicate in a way that made so much action happen that the life expectancy of someone injured in battle would just went up. I don't even know the percentage, hugely. She brought that idea to a space that was just well, it's dirty and gross. What are you going to do? And being dirty and gross was killing people. A vast majority of people died in hospital. I think she said more died in hospitals than on the actual battlefields. And so people are like, well, I don't know what that means. Oh, it's hugely terrible to get slightly injured because that's going to kill you. And we can fix this. This is all fixable. Yeah, it's a huge, I think underappreciated piece of the legacy is her ability to communicate about numbers and communicate numbers in a really high impact way.
Yeah, we really need more of that. We need that really badly. And it was, I think that was the part I was misremembering before about we may have gotten to one thing, but it was, oh boy, I'm going to forget it now. That's pretty typically me.
That's all right. It's all right.
things at the same time. Mostly I'll just go back and say Florence Nightingale's amazing, and we need
It'll come back to you. Yeah.
we have so many people trying to grab attention, and not following these guidelines and encouragements and way of bringing it home for people. And I think like there's just such a huge problem with that. If we put even a fraction of the energy that we're putting into the yelling and the fight into how could we better communicate.
Yeah. She didn't just say like more people are dying than need to. She made it super personal and super real. And I think a lot of times we get communications that are boiled down to like a little tiny soundbite that's like, this thing's bad and this thing's good because of the numbers. And you're like, that is not at all personal or relevant or actionable to be like, because of the numbers or because of science. I think those sort of things get too condensed down in a way that are just not meaningful fundamentally to people, or they're too big and then people's brains shut off, like either of those two spectrums. So I think this book is really an argument for humanizing communication, especially around numbers that our brain already has some biases towards just by being humans. We have mental biases about numbers, like 5, great, 6, who knows,
Yeah, and I finally, this is the third time's the charm I'm getting, and I'm gonna just quote out of the book.
Great, do it. I'll stop interrupting you. That'll help, right?
So it just talks about how the power of one is that it focuses on the tinier day-to-day components of the overall problem in a way that shows us the potential for progress. And there's more stuff in this chapter about that, but that's what that was making me think of. And in the need for present day is this. Climate change comes to mind. Like there's just these big things that feel so out of our reach, and it creates such like apathy and disconnection for people because it just feels like too big of a problem for them to have any impact. Whereas bringing it down to the tinier numbers makes it more like people can see that potential for a change. And that's a huge. There's a huge potential in that if we could get the word out about this.
Right. In a way that people can understand and not feel instantly overwhelmed. I think that's like the part that this is the emotional impact. Sometimes it's too much that people just shut down or stand, or like, well, I can't do anything. Why bother? That level of that response is responding to being overwhelmed by the mass or the emotion or the connection. And there's a lot of things I think in our world people feel overwhelmed by, or I don't have a part, or my voice doesn't matter, or my actions don't matter. Who am I to whatever to have an impact on this thing? How could I possibly? And I think this book is all an argument for actually you can have an impact. Actually, we can matter, but you need to understand the proportion of it a little bit. Like, yeah, you doing a little bit maybe feels not very meaningful, but everyone doing a little bit suddenly is hugely meaningful and can have much bigger impacts. Obviously, we can amplify things through many people, but we need people to understand that even their little tiny bit matters, or even if they feel overwhelmed in some of those bigger issues, cool. The things that you can do are still relevant, still meaningful, still useful. Because again, scale, numbers, because math, like essentially, which is not easy to grasp, but to be able to communicate that in a way that is impactful for people is motivational fundamentally on the flip side, other than being overwhelmed by why, it's too big. I can't even do anything.
That feels like what, we should be kind of expecting of our leaders. It's like, that's your job, is to take this information ways to make impacts in all of these different arenas, but you've got to turn around and share the plan with people in a way that they can understand and that they feel like they can make a difference in. It's out there. It's more rare than I wish it was, but I feel like there are some examples of leaders who are doing that, and I would really like it if they could all get on board.
Right? Do it more often. I think, we don't see it very often. Like maybe it's the media I've curated for myself that I don't get a great examples of numbers used well necessarily. And I think occasionally, like sometimes I'm like, oh, that was a long time, or that was a lot of people, or I think it's rare a little bit. in my world. And I mean, I'm one person, right? But I think the flip side is I don't think it's done very well often either. And for it to filter to me in a meaningful number, I'm like, oh, very few of those happen because maybe it's not done very often. That so much less of that actually makes it to my brain because it's not happening that often. But when it does, it is hugely impactful.
Right. Yeah. I think you're just making me think of how, and I've known this from a few other examples, but like, I bet there's a huge difference between the leaders that stay close, like find ways to stay close to individuals and hear individual stories, versus the ones that start to like get in a position of seeing everybody very like kind of blobby. I think that really does the difference between, because then you just don't, they're not even coming at the problem and thinking about how to talk to individuals and what they should do. They're thinking about it as a group of people and how do we
as a stereotype or as a soundbite, right? Like, and neither of which are super meaningful or impactful on a personal level if you're trying to influence personal behavior.
Right. Yeah. Whereas, you know, if you were thinking about the individuals and what do I tell every, you know, if you've been out in your community and you've met some people and you're like, okay, yeah, what do I want to say? What would I want to ask each of these people to do? Like that would make such a difference. It really
right. And then to be able to share that report of that with specific examples versus people tell me blah blah blah, and you're like, oh, okay, no one cares what people, whoever they are or whatever. But like once they say, oh, my neighbor Sarah said blah blah blah, and you're like, oh, my neighbor said that too. Weird. Okay, cool. You know, like suddenly, again, back to this being super relatable. And the example of one that can represent many is really powerful too. And seeing yourself, like you said in the beginning, seeing yourself in that example, like, oh, I have a neighbor also named Sarah. Weird. Okay, cool. Is that what she's thinking? Like, who knows? But it becomes very tangible in a way that wasn't tangible before. And I think that's the other leadership, like the sort of classic leadership problem is when we start talking in generalities, like you were just saying, it doesn't land the same way. And people don't believe it, I think, in the same way because it's not as personal or not as relevant feeling or seeming, or it just isn't as resonant as when you get it right and you make it personal and it's specific and it's concrete in a way and simple, you know, all these different things. You're like, yeah, that sounds easy. It's really tricky to do about complicated issues or about things that you want people to take action on.
Yeah, I think that's all incredibly true. Yeah, like you're making me think of there's a book. Oh boy, I'm not gonna do this for justice because I can't recall his name, and I'm not even positive that I remember the name of the book. Sorry,
but just wing it; it'll be fine.
It's got complexity. Well, it's also because I cheated. I'm remembering my husband actually read this book, and then he told me about it and told me.
Perfect. Secondhand. We'll take secondhand references. No problem.
Yeah, I will read this. I want to read this book. Is my philosophy. So anyway, I read the last. It was beautiful. It was really, really well done in talking about what to do in the face of complexity. And it was humility and action, and that was immediately what it was filled with. What you were talking about. It's like it's have the humility that this is complex and it is a challenge, and don't oversimplify or overgeneralize. But then also take action. It's still possible. We can do it. And this book is very full of very actionable pieces.
Absolutely. Like I feel like my notes on this book are super short, but each one is something I could do immediately. Like that's what, like I was just looking over like the last note I ended with. It was like, map the landmarks by finding the landmarks. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to make a map for you of things by finding the landmarks. But then the next note is use existing maps when possible. Like, duh. Yeah, I should like map this onto something you already know versus me creating a whole nother schema in your brain. Cause that's tough to do, to change how you operate and how you think. Yeah. Are there any sort of last pressing ideas from this book that you want to make sure we talk about? I know we've blabbered on for a long time already. Who knew? Who saw that coming? I did the whole time. That's why I invited you to this podcast. But
same, I know you're the best to talk to about books. I feel really great about the touchstones that we hit on. So it doesn't feel like there's this like key thing that's missing. So maybe I'll just kind of go back to at least this is what you were making me think of. I have written in one of my notes, this like bridge worlds, bridging the numbers and the emotion. And I want to say even like towards the end of the book, there's some beautiful summary of that, which I probably won't get to in time. That's fine. Yeah, I think the idea of bridging the world of numbers and the world of human beings is such a noble and important task. I think this book lays it out beautifully. I think it talks about, it kind of seamlessly goes back and forth again and again over that bridge in a way that really reinforces just how much it's possible to do that. And so, yeah, I think I just find myself being really grateful to this author. And I guess it's good for them that I also really feel like it's a book you have to own. Like I'm going to need to come back to this. Really, really rich, good stuff.
Yeah, I think there's the times I do have to convey numbers. I kind of want to have these notes at least on my fingertips to be like, how am I going to convey these numbers really in a meaningful way, in a way that people get, in a way that people understand, take action on, but really in a way that they actually just understand. I think that's the part we just gloss over. Like, oh, we want them to do something, but to get to a level of really good understanding that's like, oh my goodness, like, oh, whoa, like that level of understanding is tricky and possible with the 400,000 ideas from this book, which is many. So there you go. That's what I got for this. Awesome. Well, thanks, Melody, so much for talking with me about this book today. I'm so glad that we made this happen.
A delight. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.